Thank you. We started with a very simple question. So if our population is really going to grow by, 1 million or 900,000, and to be honest, what's the difference between those two things? Not very much. It's a big number. How are we actually going to make room for them? I mean, where exactly are they fitting in? Julie sort of explained what our physical housing envelope really can house, and so clearly there's huge stresses and strains. When we first began to look at this question, we saw, kind of the obvious, which is that there is a large number of people already sharing. So think about this number for a moment. Almost a quarter of every housing unit in New York City has more than one adult who could be a head of household in another place. That's big. I mean, that means that adult singles are kind of everywhere. And of course, this is an old story. I mean, 40% of New Yorkers today over the age of 25 who don't live with any kind of a spouse or partner, which, Graham, is sort of the answer to your question, which I can only answer if I'm looking at Sarah's data. That's a big number, but it's an old story for New York. Obviously, historically, we have always been a city that's been a magnet for singles. But now that number is really growing. Why? I mean, it's obvious. It's some of the things that Deputy Mayor Gibbs talked about. People are living longer, and people are staying single longer, and people are coming back into being single in different points in their lives for different reasons. And at the same time, housing choices for single people are really shrinking. So of the people who are single and who already live alone, which represent about 33% of our apartments, in Manhattan, it's 1 out of every 2. So 1 out of every 2 apartments in Manhattan is occupied by one person living alone. Here's how they're distributed. You see, it's very much kind of that old-fashioned, Manhattan story, which continues to be a big magnet for single people. But you're also seeing it in Western Brooklyn and parts of Queens and in the Bronx. And some of that, and then people always say, oh, well, that's the elderly. Well, only about 1/3 of these people actually are elderly. The other 2/3 are not, in fact. So when you look at those households that are sharing with another single adult, at least one other, this is how they're distributed geographically. This begins to tell quite a different story. This is really the story of the rise of our immigrant communities. And those numbers are growing. So these patterns are going to increase, not decrease over time. And yet, gone are a lot of these single people resources. So gone are most of those old residential YMCAs. This was actually the William Sloan House, which Roseanne Haggerty somewhere in the audience will know well. But this at one point had about over 1,600 beds. Gone are, my favorites, the women-only hotels, which, I don't know, just look like the sweetest thing in the world. Like, who wouldn't want to live there once, at least, in their lives? There were bachelor apartments. We still have found, one of our staff people actually lived in a building in Harlem that when she had to check the C of O because of a dispute with her landlord, it said bachelor apartments. So this was sort of more like the Sherlock Holmes idea, like you rent a room and the lady brings you tea or dinner or something. It seemed quite nice. If there were such places, I would try to get my son to move in, but he still lives with me. And then, of course, there were the lodging houses, the boarding houses, the SRO, and this is where the poor people lived, right? These photos actually come from a photographic competition that CHPC did in 1939. The actual photographs are in the permanent collection of the Museum of the City of New York. And you can see certainly and understand why there was a drive in the housing advocacy world to eradicate these conditions. And it made a lot of sense. So a lot of these did fall to enforcement. There was also, no question, a kind of the beginning, the seeds of the sort of demonization of single adults, particularly single men. This is actually the reading room at a 10-cent a night Bowery lodging house. And I don't know, these guys kind of look nice, right? I mean, they're very neat. They have these neat little spittoons on the floor, and they're all reading the newspapers. They don't seem that terrible. But these buildings did create terrible conditions, inadequate fire safety and health problems, bad management, and there was this concentration of very vulnerable people that could, over time, wreak havoc both on the buildings themselves, but also the communities outside. But none of these building types disappeared for a lack of demand. So the net result is that if you're a single adult today looking for housing in the housing market as a new entrant, you're looking at a fairly bleak story. So the first big pie is all of the housing units in New York. That little teeny weeny itsy bitsy sliver is the 2.88 vacancy rate, which is, you know, itsy bitsy, and it's been getting more itsy bitsy over time. I mean, it almost is ridiculous. I mean, most people believe a normal housing marketplace that would allow people to move when they need to move and find new housing would require about a 10% vacancy rate. So we are way, way, way below that. When you take just those 2.88%, those vacant units available for rent all across the board in the city, and you just look at those, which is the smaller pie, only about 8% of those are affordable to a single person at the median income for a single person, which means they would be looking for an apartment to rent for about $639. And that means they're also competing with everybody else who may be trying to find an affordable housing at that price. So the outlook for single people is pretty bleak. So you end up with two choices. If you have a lot of money, you know, you could rent this, you could learn to play the piano. I mean, you know, life would be grand. Or if you don't have over $100,000 of income as a single person, which probably, by the way, wouldn't even get you this apartment, but, you know, it's just going for sort of the extreme, you could rent a room in a share, and you can often end up in this kind of a situation. Now, there are certainly people that are sharing for cultural reasons by choice. I mean, everybody is not seeking a shared situation out of desperation. And some, like this is my living room, are kind of just like living for free with their families. But, you know, not that I'm doing this project for any kind of personal motivation. But I do show my own family's picture in every time I give this talk, just to remind myself. But for many single people, the situation is quite bleak, and to get this housing, you've got to go squarely into the underground housing market. And that's making you rent rooms that are, you know, probably illegal, probably don't have a proper safety exit in a fire. You certainly won't have any legal rights, and, you know, issues of privacy and protection of your property and things like that are certainly quite dodgy. These conditions, of course, pose a special risk for, like, our firefighters, who may often be unaware of the illegal partitions and the kind of furniture that they're going to confront. And that's going to block both their rescue efforts and, tragically, in some situations, has prevented them from escaping. And we've had firemen die as a result, as we have had many low-income people die in recent years in fires in situations just like this. But we also know that just enforcing the rules, as Linda said, is not going to make this problem go away. I mean, first of all, it would just create a bigger problem for Linda because she has to run the homeless system as well. But also, the demand is just not going to go away for housing of this type. So we really need to begin thinking about how to meet that demand, not just how to enforce the rules. And our housing policies have largely been focused on this idea of let's build more, let's build bigger. And that's great, but it's expensive, it takes a long time, and to increase density by building taller buildings, although that should be a sensible solution, is becoming harder and harder. And in a lot of neighborhoods, it's just, you know, completely unwelcome. So today our design teams are going to present their ideas for making room for our growing population because, again, as Linda said, we need to make room for the elderly, whose numbers are going to increase 44% by 2030, by our low-wage workers who are in our life every day, and most of us don't stop to think about where they're living and how, For the young and creative global talent, I mean, that New York City has to compete for to maintain our economic and cultural edge. And from the left, we have, you know, one person who now has moved to Chicago, the next person is in Detroit, Kate is now in London, and my daughter, you'll remember from my couch in my living room, so she's still here. But we have to compete for these people, and we have to try to do better for our aspirational immigrants. You know, I had a conversation with somebody who's, you know, runs a very big organization in this field, and when I was ranting at a cocktail party and frightening most of the guests away about this issue, he said, "Oh, Jerilyn, you know, it's an old story. Immigrants come, and of course, you know, they're going to be on the bottom, and they're going to live in terrible conditions." And I'm like, really? So my grandfather, who died in a lodging house fire in 1914 with his 2-year-old baby, that's the best we're going to offer the immigrants of today? I don't think so. I think we can do better, and I think our designers here believe that too, and I hope that they're going to challenge and provoke and inspire you to really think about how we're going to make room for these really important New Yorkers.